Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where in the country you happen to be. Welcome to FTA's webinar on the preparation and submission of the Recipient Information Request, the RIR. We know that many of you received a notice from FTA fairly recently, probably in late October, early November, advising you that you are getting a review in 2022 and asking you to provide certain information for your reviewer and answer some questions for your reviewer in advance of the review. And so this webinar is designed to help you out with that and kind of understand what the RIR is asking for and how best to respond to it so that you can have a smooth review. One thing I do want to point out is that if you haven't received notice from FTA and you thought that you're getting a review in 2022, for instance, maybe your last review was your last triennial reviews in 2019, and you thought you're getting a review in 2022, you should have received notice by now. Those were supposed to go out, like I said, in late October, early November of last year. And so if you haven't gotten a notice, you're probably not being reviewed. We did lose a year basically as a result of COVID. So what I would recommend is reach out to your point of contact at FTA, your regional office, or whoever your program manager is, and say, hey, we thought we were getting a review in 2022. Is that the case or is it not? Just confirm so that everybody's on the same page. That's the best approach to take there. So before we kick off, we'll just do some brief introductions. First of all, I am Matthew Bussey from RLS & Associates, and I am joined here today by Greg Harnett and Richard Garrity from RLS & Associates. Do you guys want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. Greg here. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. This is Rich Garrity. I'll be manning the question window in today's session.
Right. So Greg will be my co-presenter and Rich will be in the background curating questions and answering your questions. So we'll go over a little bit more about that in a second. So this is the 6th in a series of webinars that FTA has put on over the course of December and January to assist recipients in how to prepare and respond to the RIR. Obviously, today is January 13th. You're where you're supposed to be. The focus of today's review or webinar rather is going to be on recipients with annual operating expenses below 100 million. If you happen to be larger than that, though, this is going to be it'll still be helpful. We'll be covering mostly the same material. One thing I do want to note, though, is that while this presentation is exclusively on how to prepare and respond to the RIR, the Recipient Information Request, you will be getting more information from upcoming workshops. Your contractor, who is identified in your RIR letter that you received, will be performing in-depth substantive workshops on all of the areas that will be reviewed in the course of the triennial review or state management review. So it's going to depend on the contractor as far as their schedule. I believe most of those workshops will be held either in late January or early February. I think the deadline for getting them done is around July 14th. So again, while this webinar is how to respond to the recipient information request, and we're going to be fairly topical about things and just be talking about the documents you're supposed to submit, what it's actually asking, that type of thing. Those upcoming webinars conducted by your contractor will be in depth. They'll go through all 23 areas that'll be reviewed. They'll go through each of the questions, all the requirements, what the governing directives are underlying the questions, all those types of things. So if you're looking for the substance of the review, don't worry if we're a little light on it today. That will definitely be covered by your contractor at those upcoming triennial review workshops. Greg, do you want to kick off with the welcome?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. So I just want to get a few administrative items out of the way. First of all, welcome to the webinar. You might notice that in the chat box, there is a link where you can download the PowerPoint presentation for today's session. You can also download the RIR template, which you should probably already have, but we just wanted to provide that as well. And as you probably heard just a few minutes ago, we encourage you to ask questions throughout this presentation. We're very fortunate to have a large group with us today, so we ask that you use the Q&A box to type out your questions. And of course, we'll have Rich Garrity in the background responding to questions, but he's also going to pull aside some questions that might be asked multiple times or are of a more general interest. We're going to move pretty quickly through the material and save some time at the end of the webinar to talk out those questions live. Also, we want to let you know that at least 3 times throughout this webinar, we're going to have some polling questions that you can respond to. And don't overthink these. These are really just designed to help us tailor this presentation better to our audience. And actually, on that note, I think we have our very first polling question coming up. So you should see a pop-up with the poll. I'll just kind of talk through the responses as you click. So the question is, how many triennial reviews have you personally participated in? This could be your first review. Maybe you've been through 1 or 2 previous reviews. Maybe it's 3 or 4 prior reviews. And we always have a few people who are real legendary veterans and they've been through 5 or more. So please take a moment to respond. And as those results roll in, I can give you a real-time look at how we answered those questions.
All right, here are the results, Greg.
All right, perfect. So this is kind of along the lines of what I expected. By far, the most common answer was, this is my first review, with 44% of the audience. And then it goes down roughly in order. We have 32% saying 1 or 2. We've got 11%, 3 or 4. And then of course, we've got 13% are, again, those real OGs who have been through 5 or more reviews. Great, so I think we can move on. Perfect. So I just want to kind of go over the rough format of today's webinar. As Matt mentioned, today's webinar focuses on the RIR, the Recipient Information Request. If your last triennial or state management review was in FY18, you'll know this document by a slightly different name. It used to be called the Grantee Information Request. A lot of people called it the GIR, using that acronym. So this is a similar thing. We're just calling it the RIR now. We replace grantee with recipient. So we'll talk about what the RIR is and how that fits into the overall review process. And then we're going to very briefly hit on all of the 23 potentially applicable topical areas in a triennial or state management review. And we're going to go through, not necessarily line by line, but we'll give you the highlights of what you need to know in terms of how to upload these documents. We're also going to, throughout the presentation, give you some kind of tips and best practices when it comes to preparing and submitting your RIR. So we'll talk those through. I also want to let you know that, again, because the focus of today's webinar is the RIR submission process, all of you, or some of you who are up for review, have probably already started initial contact with your reviewer. So if you have any specific compliance questions, we ask that you actually direct those to your reviewer. I think at this point, it would be inappropriate for me to perhaps stand in between you and your reviewer without all the context and probably facts. And I don't want to give you a slightly different opinion. So we'll preserve that relationship between the recipients and the reviewer. At this point, if you have specific compliance questions, please reach out to your reviewer. Great, so here is our review process for both the triennial and state management reviews. There are 9 basic steps. You can see here with the recipient information request, we're on step 2, and the RIR is a step in our process where you, as the FTA recipient, are asked to provide information about your organization, and a lot of it is gathering documents to upload with your RIR submission. But just to briefly talk through a few future steps in this process, you can see that after your RIR will be due, which for many of you I think is January 21st, there might be a little variation, but after you submit your RIR, what's going to happen is your reviewing contractor and the FTA region in which you sit will have kind of a scoping process. You can see here we have ERM, that stands for Enhanced Review Module. Based on your RIR submission, your reviewer in the region will kind of take a look at any topical areas that are at a heightened risk of non-compliance, and that's where an ERM might be appropriate. So it's kind of a double click to make sure that recipients are doing well in any potentially problematic areas. And as many of you probably know, in FY22, your triennial or state management review will be conducted virtually, probably through a webinar platform like this. So you can see that there will be a virtual site visit, but before the site visit and after you submit your RIR, you may be asked to submit additional information to your reviewer. It probably won't be a heavy lift like the RIR, but specifically when we get to maintenance, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But your virtual site visit itself will probably take place anywhere between March of this year and July of this year. So fairly soon, I imagine you should be in contact with your reviewer and starting kind of that scheduling process. just very quickly, I want to talk to you about what happens after your virtual site visit. So at the very last day of the site visit, there's going to be an exit conference where your reviewing contractor will essentially give you a snapshot of any findings that they've identified throughout the course of this review. And the reason they do that then at the end of your site visit is so you know almost right away how you did, because there is a little bit of a gap between your review ending and when you receive the draft version of your compliance report. Actually, it's 21 business days. So you will, within 21 business days after the exit conference, get a draft version of your compliance report. We call it a draft not because it will be incomplete in terms of content or polish, but we just want to distinguish it between the draft and the finalized version of the report, because when you get the draft report, you'll have the opportunity to weigh in on anything that you feel is inaccurate or perhaps has been miscategorized. So your comments and feedback will likely make it into the finalized version of your compliance report, which you will receive within 45 business days after your exit conference. And if you do have any findings, as you probably know if you've been through this process before, there's typically a corrective action associated with each compliance deficiency, and there's usually a set number of days that you have to take that corrective action within. So I just want to let you know that the timeline doesn't start ticking in terms of taking those corrective actions until you receive the finalized version of your compliance report. Great, so I'm going to move right along. I'm going to talk about Section A of the RIR, the recipient profile. This is the first part of the RIR that you'll have to fill out. As you can see, there are 5 tables. I'll go through almost each one of those in the subsequent slides, so we'll just kind of save that. But I want to let you know the objectives of this recipient profile is really to provide to your reviewer a clear description of your agency in terms of its complexity, modes of operation, size, and that will help your reviewer, especially during the scoping process, understand which areas will be applicable and perhaps there will be some that are not applicable. This is specifically important, I think, in this review cycle, because as Matt mentioned, we essentially have a 4-year review window here as opposed to the typical 3-year review window. So we've got a long review window. And as we all know, within the context of this global health pandemic, a lot has changed in the past 2 years. So it's important to really communicate to your reviewer and FTA where your organization sits right now. So we ask, as you can see, there's an RIR tip that you complete this recipient profile as accurately as possible. If, for instance, you're unsure of something or you're wondering if a specific thing that you might have to upload is applicable or not, I would communicate to your reviewer and perhaps note that in the RIR document itself. We're still very early in the process, so I think this is the time to kind of err on the side of being over-inclusive. We have plenty of time to perhaps address potential compliance issues, but if you kind of save those questions till the end, we might not have that opportunity. Great, so here's an example of table 1. You can see that we've just kind of populated it with dummy information here, but we ask that you make sure the information you're entering here in your RIR in table 1 is, first of all, accurate as of the time of you submitting your RIR, and it should be consistent with all of the supporting documents that you're going to upload. So if you have any documents that don't necessarily reflect for perhaps your current service area and things like that, then that's maybe a sign that you have to probably go back and update some of those documents. We also ask that you list any sub-recipients or contractors you've had, not only right now, but during our 4-year review period, and that'll just provide additional context that will help your reviewer. Also, as you probably know, the Triennial and state management reviews are really focused on FTA-funded programs, but we ask in this operations profile, include any contractors or lessees that are locally funded as well, and that'll just help your reviewer develop a larger picture of your organization and understand perhaps which operations are on the table for review and which may not be. Great, so we're continuing on. We're still on table 1. I just want to point out a few additional things. You'll see there's a spot where you have to identify the span of service by your different modes, if applicable. We ask that in this table, you enter kind of the span of service exactly as you see it here. So with actual start and stop times, it's not as helpful if you, for instance, say, on weekdays, we operate fixed route for 12 hours. Try to put actual start and stop times in terms of the duration. Also, you'll see there's information asking you to identify all of your transit-related facilities. And specifically, you want to note any facility that has FTA interest. And what that means is the facility was constructed either in whole or in part with FTA monies, or it was renovated with FTA money. So that will become important. Maybe you're kind of anticipating this. When we talk about maintenance, we'll talk about why that triggers some additional obligations. Great, so we're going to skip over table 2 because it's just for states, and we probably don't have many state DOTs in the audience today. We actually had a separate webinar that focused just on that. So I want to go next to table 3. It's asking about sub-recipient facilities. Obviously, this would only be applicable if you have FTA sub-recipients. So if you don't, you would mark this as not applicable and skip it. But as a general rule that you might hear echoed a few times throughout this presentation, as an FTA recipient, you essentially stand in the shoes of your sub-recipients when it comes to their compliance. In other words, if you have sub-recipients, you have an obligation to exercise oversight and make sure that they're operating in compliance with all of the relevant rules and regulations. So that's why we're asking about sub-recipient facilities here. Obviously, if you have more than one sub-recipient, you would want to identify which sub-recipient we're talking about. You'd provide a description of the facility. Is it a transit center? Is it a maintenance facility? You would want to indicate the source of FTA funding. Is it section 5307, perhaps section 5339? And then the year completed and location in terms of street address, I think are fairly self-explanatory. Moving right along, table 4, award activity. So this is asking for a narrative response from you, and there are 3 basic things that you're going to write about. First, you're going to provide a brief description of any noteworthy projects that your organization has completed since your last review. And then you're going to provide a description of any noteworthy projects that are currently ongoing. And then you're going to kind of look forward to the future and describe any noteworthy projects that you're planning on undertaking within the next 3 to 5 years. So we ask that you indicate if these projects are locally funded or FTA funded. This is also a good opportunity, I think, for FTA recipients to take credit for projects that you've completed. As you might know, if you've been through this process before, your compliance report is what we call an exceptions-based report. So really, we don't have the opportunity as authors of those reports to write about all the wonderful things we see, but a form of this table does actually make it into the introductory section of the report. So, if you provide some good explanation here, your reviewer can take that information and make sure it is reflected in the report. And we also ask that when you're looking at your future projects, you note any projects that might be novel, new, difficult, or just on a size or of a complexity that is different from anything you've done before. And that's just to get these projects on FTA's radar so your region can ensure that you're well equipped to successfully undertake these projects. Great, so we have another poll question. We'll put the poll up now and I'll just kind of read through the responses as you click which one applies to you. So we are wondering, what is your primary topic of focus for this triennial review? So we've taken all of the subject areas and separated them into different buckets. So the first bucket is civil rights. That's ADA, DBE, Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity. Or perhaps it's procurement. That's my favorite area. Or maybe it's kind of the maintenance suite of topics. So maintenance, transit asset management, satisfactory continuing control, or maybe it's financial management and technical capacity. As you'll see, technical capacity is actually 3 chapters kind of under that umbrella. We also have an option for legal, school bus, charter bus, DFWA, that's Drug-Free Workplace Act, and drug and alcohol testing program. Or perhaps you're more interested in the programmatic areas like section 5307, section 5310, or maybe you don't want to be defined or boxed in and you're saying all of the above. So we'll feed back right now. Okay, so actually all of the above is the most popular choice with 47%. I think that's a good orientation. This is a comprehensive review. It's going to kind of hit all these topics, but also popular was procurement and financial management and technical capacity. So we'll keep that in mind as we work through this material with you. Great, so I can pass it back to you, Matt.
Great, thank you, Greg. So the next section of the RIR, the Recipient Information Request, is where we actually get into the document uploads, or the documents requested rather. So as has been mentioned before, there are 23 different review areas that now comprise the comprehensive guide, or the contractor's manual. It used to be called the comprehensive guide. Excuse me, I misspoke. You guys may be familiar with it as the comprehensive guide, but now it's called the contractor's manual. So there are 23 different areas, though, that are going to be reviewed as part of your review. And for each of those, we go section by section throughout the RIR. And for each of those, there are 3 basic things in each. First of all, it'll state the basic requirement. So here, just as an example, we are showing the basic requirement for financial management and capacity. Then the next aspect is the document table. This is composed of a couple different things. First of all, it states the required document that you're being asked to provide. In this case, we've got financial statements or Ffrs. Next column says applicability, and so it'll state what the applicability is. For instance, if it's subrecipient, if the required document is subrecipient oversight procedures, it's only going to be applicable to recipients that have subrecipients. So the applicability column will clarify that. The next column, date submitted, it seems a little silly perhaps, but it is helpful for the reviewer. The reviewer, you're going to be uploading a lot of documents, and your reviewer is going to be going through those folders and examining all the documents. And if they can't find something, they can go back to your RIR and it says, oh, you did submit it, or at least thought you submitted it. Maybe there's a technical glitch or something like that. They can reach out and make sure they get that from you, and everything will be good. So that's just kind of the helpful part of the date submitted. The next aspect is the electronic file name, which is pretty self-explanatory, but we will touch on that a little bit more in a second. And then finally, the final column is comments from the recipient. And this final column we consider the most important. We advise you to use it as liberally as possible. This is basically where you can provide explanation for anything that needs explanation. So if you didn't submit something because it wasn't applicable, this is your opportunity to explain to the reviewer why you felt it wasn't applicable. If you didn't submit something because it's in the process of being updated, and so you're going to provide it at a later date, perhaps your Title VI program, those are turned in every 3 years. If you're just about to submit your newest Title VI plan, then you may just say, hey, we're superseding our current Title VI plan with a new one. It's going to be approved by the board later this month, and we'll provide it to you then. So the comments from recipient column is really helpful for just providing to your reviewer any additional information, especially when you haven't uploaded something. It provides that extra explanation to your reviewer. Then finally, in each of the 23 areas, not all of the 23 areas actually, but several of them, then there's some open-ended questions. And for those of you who last had a triennial review back in the days of the grantee information request, the GIR, as Greg mentioned, you probably remember that document had a ton of questions that they were asking you to write in a narrative response to. And it was a little lighter on the uploads of documents. It's kind of pulled a 180 since then, and the current RIR is predominantly a document request. There still are a few questions that FTA would like you to provide a narrative response to. And so in the couple sections in the RIR where there are open-ended questions at the end, go ahead and please answer those with as much detail as you can. I'll give your reviewer context. So as I mentioned with the labeling documents, FTA has a preferred folder and file naming convention that's outlined here. And don't worry, this is included at the beginning of your RIR, so you don't have to, you can go back and refer to that in the RIR document. Label the folders as shown so the reviewer can easily identify the document. Obviously, a lot of documents are being submitted. It's really helpful if, first of all, you can identify what the document is clearly, and also this will clue in your reviewer as to what the document is responding to, what requirement you're uploading it in response to. So we know that obviously the days of snail mail are long gone. Most reviewers are going to collect this information, these documents from you via a FTP site, a file sharing protocol site, and think Dropbox or something similar to that. And so work with your reviewer. I'm sure that they'll provide you instructions on exactly how to utilize their file sharing protocol website. So just work with them on that. And one tip that we definitely recommend, we know that for most of you, your RIR response is due next Friday, the 21st. Again, there could be a little variation, but test your credentials now or as soon as you get those from your reviewer. One thing that you definitely don't want to do is, if your RAR response is due on the 21st, 11:59 p.m. on the 21st comes around and you try and log in to submit your RAR response and your credentials don't work. That's not good for anybody. So definitely test that out as early as possible so you don't get caught in that quagmire. So there are, again, 23 review areas that'll be covered. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but I will just point out a couple that are probably new if you haven't had a review since 2018. The first is Transit Asset Management, TAM. And then two others that were actually just added this year are, first of all, Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan, PTASP, and then also cybersecurity. So 23 areas, and those are the new kids. So now we can actually start going through the review areas and looking at the requested documents and kind of what they mean and what's being asked. For legal, then the first thing that's asked for is a list of litigations, breaches, defaults, disputes, or instances where the federal government was named as a party to litigation or a legal disagreement. Then in addition to that, then the RAR is asking for a list of false claims received, any claims under the False Claims Act, any instances of fraud, waste, or abuse, anything along those lines. And there are a couple things to keep in mind here. First of all, we're just talking about transit. And so if you are perhaps a city and you have multiple departments and there's litigation or a claim or something like that that happened in another department that's totally removed from transit, then you can safely ignore that. That's not going to be relevant for your reviewer. The other thing is that if there were any litigations or breaches or false claims or anything like that, then that does trigger additional requirements. You have to notify either FTA's chief counsel or the FTA regional counsel. And so those are follow-up items that if this applies, if you have any of these, your reviewer is going to eventually request those. Probably makes sense if you have those communications that you can provide, just to go ahead and provide them at this point. And then the last thing is I would just suggest that you coordinate your list development with your legal counsel. Obviously, they would probably be able to provide some insight with regard to these. The next thing, and these two here, they're not actually asked for in the RAR, but we did include them. They are included as follow-up items in the contractor's manual, and we think they're very important. They could be applicable to you. The first thing is that if you've conducted any lobbying during the review period, which again, from 2018, basically the date of your last exit conference through your virtual review in 2022, if you've conducted any lobbying, you need to be able to show that you've submitted that Office of Management and Budget, OMB, the LLL form on a quarterly basis where applicable. Obviously, we know that you can't lobby for transit purposes with federal dollars, but you are allowed to lobby for transit purposes if you're using non-federal dollars. And so if you have done that at any point during the last 4 years and you filed those LLLs to apprise that you have in fact been conducting lobbying, then provide those. And similarly, if you have any sub-recipients or contractors or subcontractors who have done any type of lobbying activities, then do the same for them. So one thing that we're going to do in the course of this webinar, we have a bunch of RAR tips that we just think will help you with the process when you're putting everything together. First of all, for files used to satisfy multiple requested documents, please indicate where in the file the information can be found. So, if you've got a procurement procedure and it's 200 pages long and, the reviewer is asking something about, liquid damages, if you can just point out, liquidated damages are covered on page 83, that'll go a long way for your reviewer to be able to check all the boxes and make sure everything that they're looking for is there. Similarly, if no document is uploaded or no web link is provided, please indicate why in that recipient comment box that we mentioned before. That's really important and will provide context to your reviewer and make things go a lot more smoothly. And here we just have an example going back to our legal section. This is a really well filled out document table. We see here the first requests and legals, that list of litigations, etc. Our fictional transit agency, XYZ Transit, has done a great job here. They've marked NA not applicable under the electronic file name because they didn't actually submit anything. But then the comments from recipient, then they explain very clearly they haven't had any litigations, breaches, defaults, etc. At the time that they submitted the RAR response. And obviously, one thing to note is that, obviously this will be current as of, this will be the explanation from the recipient as of when they filed the RAR response. Your review could be way down the line later in the year, could be in July or something like that, and things might have changed. And so your reviewer will, take this as, okay, as of the date of the RIR submission, then there weren't any of these instances, but during the review, they will follow up and make sure that there weren't any in the interim between when you submit the RIR response and when you actually have the review. So this is just a good example of how to communicate this information to your reviewer. Greg, do you want to talk financial
Sure.
management
I'll pick
capacity?
it up here. Thanks, Matt.
Mhm.
So the second topic, financial management and capacity. In item A, the RIR is asking for financial statements or comprehensive annual financial reports. You might know that by the acronym CAFR for the past 3 years, but we actually know that for FY22, it's going to be the past 4 years. You almost have a quadrennial review, if I may. One thing I want to clarify about the CAFRs is there are different formats I've seen these reports in. If you have a CAFR that is kind of separated out into 2 documents and one of them is a compliance supplement, please also provide that to your reviewer. That's perhaps what your reviewer would be more interested in seeing. In item B, the RIR is asking for any internal audits for the review period. This might only apply to larger recipients who actually have an internal audit department, but if you do, please provide that. Moving on to item C, the RIR is asking for a list of funds that support your transit programs for the past 4 years, our review window, and also looking ahead for the next 3 years. One thing specifically that your reviewer would be interested in seeing is any funding sources that are at risk of drying up. A good example is if you benefit from a tax that is planned to sunset in the future, please indicate that. Moving on to item D, I want to draw particular attention to this. So you have to provide with your RIR submission financial management policies and procedures. And if you look at the contractor's manual, you'll see this is very clear in that document. There are 2 things that absolutely have to be in writing in your financial management policies and procedures. The first is you need to have some procedures for determining the allowability of costs. And the second is procedures regarding the timely distribution of funds. And what we mean by that, we're really talking about the ECHO process. So if you're drawing down ECHO monies in advance and you then have to expend or disperse those monies within 3 business days. So you essentially can't draw down money from your grant and just walk around with that in your pocket in perpetuity. So I know a lot of you also are probably working on a reimbursement basis, not an advance drawdown basis. If that is the case, just also make sure you have that in writing and you say perhaps something to the effect of, we are aware that if we were to operate on an advanced drawdown basis, we would disperse those funds within 3 business days. Great, continuing on, item E, I won't spend too much time on this. This is just for states. If you are a state, item E is asking for the Cash Management Improvement Act, CMIA agreement. Moving on to item F, the RIR is asking for an organizational chart that kind of shows your whole organization and where the finance function or department sits within that. Items G and H, I'll kind of talk about these together because they're very similar. So in item G, the RIR is asking for job descriptions for senior financial and accounting staff who are really the key financial staff managing the FTA funds. And then the RIR in item H is asking for the actual resumes of those individuals identified in your item G upload. And really what your reviewer will just seek to do is make sure that individuals who have those positions have the qualifications that your organization said are needed. Great, continuing on, really everything on this slide is kind of along the same line. So again, I'll talk about it together. So items I, J, and K, the RIR is asking for sample records from your financial management software or your financial system. So as you can see throughout here in the guidance column, you'll see some citations to 2 CFR 200. That's OMB's uniform guidance. A lot of people also call it the super circular. So check out those citations for the specific data elements that have to be in these sample reports. But just to run through it quickly, you can see in item J, the sample financial record should include the federal award information, the amount awarded, authorized, encumbered, and expended, and also any income earned. In item K, I just want to highlight that this is looking for your most recent variance reports. So this is kind of your budget to actual. And again, you can see the 2 CFR citation that'll give you a little bit more information about the required data elements there. Matt, great job on advancing the slides. It's like you're reading my mind. I want to actually highlight item L here too. So the RIR is asking for your sample worksheets that you're using to calculate operating expenses. This is significant in our FY22 reviews because we know that there are FTA recipients who perhaps in the past did not receive operating assistance, but within the context of our pandemic and various emergency relief programs like the CARES Act, you may be receiving operating assistance for the first time. So if this is new to you, just make sure you have a good process in place. And you can see here, we have a citation to FTA Circular 9030.1E. Specifically, Appendix C2 has a really nice operating expense worksheet. So check that out. Moving on to item M, the RIR is asking for a financial plan that projects revenues and expenses for the next 3 years. This is often either a short range financial plan or maybe a longer range plan. We just want you to know if you are uploading a large document and this piece of information is just in a specific spot, please note in the comments column of your RIR submission which page this information appears on. It'll just help direct your reviewer's attention to the relevant info. Item N, the RIR is asking for your operating and capital budgets for your review period, and this can take the form of a year-end report from your financial software. Moving on to item O, it's asking for a listing of local or state legislation with sunset provisions that would impact transit funding. So again, kind of on the lines of what I said a little bit earlier, any at-risk funding sources, your reviewer would want to be informed of that. In item Q, we're talking about the annual budget to actual reconciliation for the entire review period. And item R is a list of sub-recipients that perhaps charge an indirect cost to your organization. Obviously, if you don't have any sub-recipients, this would be not applicable. Great. Here's some RIR tips. So if it sounds like that was a lot of information, first of all, it was. I think financial management and capacity is probably one of the heavier lifts in terms of what you need to upload with your RIR submission. But we recommend as you're preparing your RIR, I would have your contractor's manual. As Matt mentioned, this used to be called the Comprehensive Review Guide, but now it's the Contractor's Manual. That's a great companion piece to the RIR. If you have both of those documents in front of you, you'll be able to very quickly kind of do the crosswalk and understand, okay, I need to upload this document, and here is why, and here's the corresponding question in the Contractor's Manual. So it'll just give you that kind of entire perspective on that. And as you can see, the Triennial Review and the State Management Review is essentially an open book test. And I would say the textbook for this course would be the FY22 Contractor's Manual. It's hot off the press. It's on FTA's website right now, so please download that. Great, let's continue on. I can pass it back to you, Matt, for the technical capacity sections.
All right, thank you, Greg. So up next is technical capacity, which, as was alluded to earlier, is actually split into 3 different sections. We've got award management, we've also got program management, and we've got project management. So we'll start with the requested documents for award management. Item A here, the first thing is, if written, award management and reporting procedures. And so what this is referring to is anything that you use for your award management processes. So if you have policies and procedures on how you complete FFRs, your federal financial reports, and your MPRs, your milestone progress reports, who's doing those, who's responsible for them, how do you submit them timely, how do you make sure that they have the required information in each of them, all those different types of things. If you have that written down, provide it to your reviewer. For each of these, it's really going to be your reviewer is going to try and get as much context about your organization as possible in advance of the review, so they can know in or go in, knowing basically everything that they need to know. Everything that you can provide in these areas is going to help provide that context. So policies and procedures on completing the FFRs and MPRs. If you have policies and procedures relating to developing your echo draws, again, who is responsible for requesting the echo draw, who's responsible for approving it, who's going to do the actual draw, how are we making sure that the echo draw doesn't happen until it's been approved. And going back to the financial section, obviously you want that cash management policy that Greg mentioned that has to be in writing, stating that if you do draw down on an advanced basis, that you'll disperse those funds within 3 business days. All of these types of things are going to be handy so that your reviewer understands what your process is for echo draws. If you provide all that information, really it just means that your reviewer is just going to have to check your implementation, make sure that what you're doing in practice mirrors what you have in your procedures. So that's why this is so important. Another example of award management reporting procedures is your policies and procedures relating to submitting and managing single audits. So if you expend more than $750,000 in a federal fiscal year, then you have to conduct a single audit. So if you have any procedures as far as how you go about doing that, how you make sure that they're submitted on time, all that, then provide those to your reviewer as well. In item B here, then the RER is asking for a closeout schedule for all open awards. And so one of the things that your reviewer is going to do is they're going to go into TRAMS and they're going to look at all of your open awards. And one of the things that they're probably going to note is if there are any older awards, you know, a 3-year-old award that hasn't had a disbursement in the last year or something like that, if there are any stale awards, if there are any ones that are completed or fully or almost fully expended and probably should be closed. The closeout schedule is basically your way of communicating to the reviewer, hey, this is what we're going to do about all the awards that we have open. And if there is anything wonky that needs explanation, then you can provide that explanation. Moving on to the second part of technical capacity, program management and sub-recipient oversight. I'm going to skip over the first couple aspects here because those are predominantly applicable to states. We'll start with program management plans. If you're a designated recipient with Section 5310 or Section 5339 sub-recipients, then you have to have a program management plan. Please provide that to your reviewer. For item E, provide your standard subrecipient application and award documents for each program. Obviously, this is only applicable if you have subrecipients. If you have provide these types of things, identify them by program, and also provide the actual subrecipient agreement that you have with the subrecipients. That'll all be helpful. For item F, a list of all subrecipients within the past 3 years, which, as we've been reiterating, is really 4 years. List again these by program, and I think Greg mentioned this when he was going through the operations profile, but remember that you want to provide this list to your reviewer and include recipients that you had at any point during the review period. So maybe in 2019 you had a subrecipient but you don't anymore. You still want to let your reviewer know that because they're going to want to check out what oversight you're conducting of that subrecipient even though you no longer have them. For item G, a subrecipient oversight schedule for the past 3 years and the next 3 years. Really, this is providing to your reviewer kind of they're interested in what your processes are. So if you have subrecipients, detail what oversight you've conducted. When did you go meet them? Did you perform a site visit? Did you collect their EO plan? And did you review their Title VI plan for sufficiency? Do you have minutes of those meetings or emails or correspondence or anything to demonstrate that oversight being performed? So provide that for the last 3 years. And then if you do have a schedule for when you're going to be conducting future oversight activities, then obviously for the next 3 years as well. And one thing, just obviously we're in COVID, we're in a global pandemic. And so there may have been significant changes to how you conducted oversight in the last couple of years. Maybe in 2018 or 2019, then you're actually conducting site visits. Now you've transitioned to doing virtual meetings or phone calls or those types of things. That's perfectly okay. Your reviewer is aware that there's a pandemic. FTA is aware that there's a pandemic. So they're going to be totally understanding of that. They're still going to want to know what your process is, how your process has changed, and just because that's helpful for the context, and it's also helpful just FTA looks to see how recipients have adapted to the challenges and hardships that COVID has presented. Item H is kind of piggyback on G, what your oversight procedures are. So if, for example, when you're doing those visits, whether they were in-person visits or whether they're virtual, if the result of that was a report that you put together, or if you have oversight checklists or monitoring materials or any training materials that you give to your subrecipients to educate them on how to be compliant with FTA requirements, any of those types of things, if you could provide that to your reviewer, they will appreciate it. Then moving on to the last section of technical capacity, which is project management. First things first, provide a list of FTA-funded capital projects undertaken during the review period. And for each of these capital projects include both the type of the project and also the total cost of the project. And in item B, it's requesting project management plans if written, and it says not required in all projects. The reason that this is, it states that is because the type and project cost indicate certain additional requirements. So if you have a capital project that's over 100 million, in other words, a major capital project, then you have to have a formal project management plan. If you have smaller projects, ones that are not $100 million or more, then you can just, all you need to have are mechanisms for technical oversight of the project. So if you have major capital projects, provide your formal project management plans. If you have smaller projects, just provide what your technical oversight mechanisms are, which could include project management plans. There's nothing that prohibits you from doing that. Just provide, though, whatever you have as far as how you conduct oversight. For item C, quality control procedures if written. So if you have any quality control procedures that basically you use to help make sure that projects stay on budget, that they stay on schedule, that you make sure that you obtain all requisite permits and licensing and zoning and whatnot before you actually start incurring costs, anything that you have that's written as far as quality control, provide that. For item D, identify FTA-funded capital projects with significant delays and/or cost increases. And just note that this requirement extends beyond construction projects. So even if it's just purchase of rolling stock or something like that, if you have significant delays or significant cost increases, then just let your reviewer know. Again, they're going to be understanding that in COVID, obviously a lot of projects were delayed for a lot of different reasons, and so don't worry about that. Just provide the list to your reviewer, and they'll just follow up, and you guys can discuss the particular delays or cost increases and go through that. Similarly, if you have any sub-recipients who had significant delays or cost increases, provide that information as well, just so that your reviewer knows that and can follow up on how you oversaw your sub-recipient to try and mitigate those cost delays or schedule delays. Cost increases or schedule delays, excuse me. Next up in project management, procedures for administering and monitoring construction projects, bus procurements, and other capital projects if written. A list of FTA-funded projects for which you or any of your subrecipients use force account labor. Obviously, force account labor is when you use your own staff to work on a project. There are some follow-ups. If you're going to be using force account valued at over $1 million or more, then you have to basically submit a force account plan to FTA. If you are going to have your staff perform over $10 million of force account labor, then you actually have to submit that force account plan to FTA and get it approved before you start incurring costs. So just things to keep in mind when you provide that list of the FTA funded projects for which you or subrecipients use force account labor. There are going to be some follow-up items potentially that your reviewer will ask for. Next up in H, just a list of transit service contractors and lessees, if applicable. Item I, a standard transit management or service operator contract and or lease agreements. And item J, in the same vein, oversight procedures, including oversight checklists, monitoring materials, etc., for transit management or service contractors or lessees. So here we have a couple more RIR tips. It's a tough one to say sometimes. If you upload a document, please indicate where in the document the relevant piece of information can be found. I know we kind of said that earlier, but it's worth beating a dead horse on this one. If possible, upload searchable documents. One thing that can kind of, just on an aside, if you upload a document that looks like it was written on a typewriter that's very old, it's possibly going to clue in your reviewer that maybe a little bit more attention is necessary. For instance, if you have an EO plan that was from before 2012 when the small business element was implemented, then that would be something that would clue in the reviewer, hey, I better check and make sure that's in there, because obviously you've got a document that's before that requirement came into place. Things like that. Drug and alcohol policies, obviously there's been a lot of updates to the regulations over the years, and so if you've got a 10-year-old drug and alcohol policy, then that's going to clue in the reviewer that might be problematic and to give it a little extra attention. And so Provide a searchable documents to the extent possible. And if they're not searchable, if it's something from, the early 2000s or something, that might be worth dusting off and updating and providing to your reviewer the updated version. If you don't have a written policy or procedure to attach, explain what the policy or procedure is in practice. So if you don't actually have a procedure for how you're going to develop MPRs and FFRs, if you can just write out a little bit so that you can explain to your reviewer what you do in practice, then that will definitely be helpful for them. And then if requested document does not apply, then explain why. You don't have sub-recipients, or you don't meet the EO threshold or the DB threshold, et cetera. Just use that comment box, literally explain why something doesn't apply. Greg, back to you for transit asset management.
Thanks, Matt.
Mhm.
So this is actually going to be a new topic for you if your last review was in 2018. So this will be the first time that you'll be reviewed on this within the context of your triennial or state management review. So up first, the RIR is asking for your TAM plan. And this is actually where I should kind of draw a distinction. There are two different types or tiers of TAM plans. So if your organization operates more than 100 vehicles in peak service, you are a tier 1 recipient and you have to prepare your very own TAM plan. If it's fewer than 100 vehicles in peak service, you're a tier 2 recipient and you have the option of either preparing your own plan or perhaps joining another plan as a group plan participant. So keep that distinction in mind. It's going to come into play as we work through this material. Item B, the RIR is asking for your NTD, National Transit Database Target Report. This is that annual report. Item C is actually kind of related to that, so I'm going to just describe this very quickly. You should have the actual performance measures and targets that you set annually. So as you might know, for vehicles and equipment, the performance target calculations are going to be expressed as a percentage of the ULB useful life benchmark. For facilities, there's a different scale of kind of rating condition. It's the term scale. So you might have seen this. It's actually 5 adjectives that range from excellent all the way down to poor that describe the condition of the facility. And this is only if you operate rail service. You would also have to express your infrastructure as a percent of track segments that have performance restrictions. Moving on to item D, the RIR is asking for the position and job description of the accountable executive. So every TAM plan needs to have an actual identifiable person as the accountable executive, and they're responsible for developing and executing the TAM plan. Great, moving on. In item E, the RIR is asking for evidence that your TAM plan was shared with the state and or the MPO that provides you funding. Any kind of email correspondence or kind of similar record of transmitting that information would be a good way to show your reviewer that you've done that. Moving on to item F, the RIR asks for supporting records or documents of your TAM plan. So if perhaps your performance targets, investment strategies, or your annual condition assessment report isn't really lumped into the TAM, maybe it's a series of appendices, you would also obviously want to provide those to your reviewer with the RIR submission. Now moving on, starting with item G, I'm going to be talking about those group TAM plans. So if you are a group TAM plan sponsor, you need to provide documentation that you've coordinated with all the group plan participants. So in other words, if entities are participating in your group TAM plan, they actually have to be actively involved in the development of that plan. Moving on to item H, the RIR asks for notification from each group plan participant's accountable executive that that participant approves the group plan. So what's important here, and you've probably picked up on this, even if you are a group TAM plan participant, you still need to have your very own accountable executive. Perfect. Moving on, item I, the RIR is asking for a list of any sub-recipients that have opted out of your group plan. So you would want to provide an actual letter, some kind of communication that affirmatively says that they're opting out of your plan. Item J, the RIR asks for documentation that the group plan sponsor made the TAM plan available to all the participants in an easily accessible format. Again, this can take the form of some correspondence, an email that you upload. In item K, the RIR asks for evidence that the recipient is participating in a group TAM plan, such as a listing of group plan participants. So really what this means is somewhere in your group TAM plan, you need to actually list out specifically and explicitly those organizations that are participants in the group plan. So it should really take the form of that kind of extracted page from your TAM plan. And then moving on, item L, the position and job description for accountable executive. Again, each group TAM plan participant has to have their own accountable executive. Great. And now moving on, item M, the RAR is asking for oversight tools. So if you have a tier 1 subrecipient, so remember tier 1 means that organization needs to prepare its very own TAM plan. They wouldn't be part of your group plan. Or maybe it's a tier 2 subrecipient that has opted out. Perhaps they've chosen to prepare their own TAM plan. You still, of course, need to exercise oversight of your subrecipients. So even if they're not part of your group TAM plan, you need to show that or ensure that they are actually adhering to the TAM requirements. Great. Continuing on to the next section, satisfactory continuing control. In item A, the RER is asking for any property management procedures you have if they are in writing. In item B, the RER asks for a listing of FTA-funded real property. As you can see, if you look at both the contractor's manual and of course 2 CFR 200, there are various required data elements that have to be in this listing of real property. And this would include land, but obviously improvements or structures on that land, and any appurtenances, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying anything fixed to a structure. Looking at item C, the RAR asks for an excess FTA funded real property plan. So this is only if you have excess property. If you do, you have to have a plan that identifies the reasons why you have that excess property, and kind of as a look forward to the future, it should have some kind of roadmap for either fully utilizing that facility or maybe disposing of it if that is the best option. In item D, the RAR is asking for sample real property incidental use agreements. So this is only if it's applicable. You would provide a copy of those agreements, and your reviewer is just seeking to confirm that certain required elements are present in that agreement. Moving on to item E, the RAR is asking for a listing of FDA-funded facilities planned to be constructed or renovated. So depending on how far you are along in that process, you would present either the projected or actual start date, the projected or actual completion date, and the FTA portion and the total project cost. In item F, actually, so F, G, and H, I'm going to kind of talk about together. These are not new requirements, but I can tell you these do represent an area of increased focus from FTA's perspective. So for F, you want to provide actual procedures that your organization is using to determine if you have any FTA-funded facilities or content that are located in a special flood hazard area. So there's more information about this in the contractor's manual. You'll see that a special flood hazard area is defined as a FEMA 100-year flood zone. And actually on FEMA's website, you can actually put in a street address and it'll show you kind of a satellite image with an overlay. Usually it's in blue that indicates any special flood hazard area. So you would want a procedure in place that communicates exactly how you're doing that. Now, if you do have any FTA funded facilities located in one of those flood hazard areas, then you have a requirement to carry insurance that is sufficient to cover FTA's interest in the facility and also the contents of the facility. And then of course, related to that, you would want to upload actual evidence of this flood insurance, and that would be policy documentation such as a certificate of insurance. Great, continuing on. In I, the RAR is asking for equipment management procedures. So these are kind of along the lines of a procedure that expresses how you are controlling your inventory, if you have any loss prevention efforts in place. Also, it would detail insurance requirements and disposition procedures. I've gotten a few questions about like what loss prevention means. So if you're storing your vehicles, perhaps behind a fence in a well-lit area, maybe you have cameras on it, or perhaps a security guard who's just making sure those vehicles aren't tampered with. That's exactly the type of detail you would want to express in these procedures. So it's a case-by-case thing. Those are just a few examples. In item J, the RER is asking for documentation of your last physical inventory along with any reconciliation that may have resulted from that inventory. So when we're talking about the physical inventory, this is going to apply to your rolling stock, but also items of FTA funded equipment. You know, usually capital items are defined as costing more than $5,000 or having a useful life of more than 1 year. So at least once every 2 years, you actually need to do a physical inventory of all your FTA funded assets. And if something isn't where you think it is, or the condition is different, you're going to have some kind of reconciliation disposition. And of course, you can see we have a 2 CFR 200 super circular or OMB uniform guidance citation to exactly what those data elements in that process should look like. Moving on to item K, a list of vehicles. Save this piece because it's going to be relevant when we talk about maintenance in a bit. So you're going to provide a listing of your vehicles. You want to identify the status of each vehicle. Most of them will probably be active, although you might have a contingency fleet. We'll talk about that in a second. Perhaps you have a few vehicles awaiting disposition. You would want to note that too. You'd also want to note if these vehicles are funded by FTA or some other program, and if they're directly operated by your organization, or perhaps they're leased to another entity. And you want to identify how these vehicles are maintained. Are you doing it in-house, or perhaps you have a third-party maintenance contractor? And also you would want to identify if these vehicles are presently under warranty and if they have any incidental use. So you can see here that a tabular presentation with all of these required fields is probably the best way to package and communicate this information to your reviewer. It's not required, but we note that a table such as an Excel file that has a column for each one of these data elements is a best practice. Great, continuing on in item L, the RAR asks for a list of FTA funded equipment that you've disposed of during our review period. So as you might know, some important things that kind of affect how you should dispose of assets are, did the asset have any remaining useful life at the time of disposition? What was the value at disposition? And how did you use those proceeds? So again, a tabular presentation would be the best way to communicate this to your reviewer. In item M under satisfactory continuing control, the RAR is asking for documentation of your peak fixed route bus service requirements. Now, this is pretty obvious. This is only applicable to fixed route operators. You want to make sure, though, you're providing the actual date of this peak period reporting, because as we know, especially within the last 2 years, service levels have changed many times just in response to this ongoing health crisis. So be sure you highlight the date, and also if this information is different from what you report on an annual basis for NTD, please explain that discrepancy. Moving on to item N. So if you have more than 50 vehicles, FTA considers that a large enough sample size, so they say you should have about a 20% spare vehicle ratio. If you deviate from 20%, and this is actually, I think, becoming common just due to how service levels have changed within the context of the pandemic, you would want to show some kind of evidence that you've reached out to your FTA region and you've requested a deviation from that 20% standard. Great, let's continue on to the next slide. Okay, so we're still under satisfactory continuing control. Remember I said we'll talk about contingency fleet in a bit. So a contingency fleet is typically a set of vehicles that perhaps have reached the end of their useful life, but they're still serviceable and they're being stockpiled for a particular purpose. A very common example is for use in a potential emergency like evacuation. So if you do have a contingency fleet, you need to provide a contingency fleet plan. And this plan should justify the need for having the contingency fleet. It should also talk about how the vehicles are being stored and maintained. So that's O. Moving on to item P, the RAR is asking for a rail fleet management plan. Should be pretty clear that this is only applicable to recipients who provide rail service. So you can see that there are 6 required elements there, but in the interest of time, I'm going to continue on to item Q. You would provide a sample lease agreement with any private operators you have. And again, this is just because your reviewer will take a look at that agreement and seek to confirm that certain required elements are present. So here's some RAR tips. We ask that you try to be as accurate as possible when you're answering the questions about which assets or facilities have a federal interest. As we saw kind of in the earlier slides of this presentation, you know that that's one of the things you'll have to provide in Section A of the RAR, indicate if your facilities have FTA interest. Now, that's important, especially when we're talking about facility maintenance. If you have an FTA funded facility, then you have to provide a written facility maintenance plan, and then also evidence that you're actually conducting this scheduled maintenance and inspection activity that's detailed in the written plan. Moving on to the second bullet point here, also please try to be as accurate as possible when you're indicating if you have sub-recipients or contractors. Sometimes the definition can be a little nebulous, and I have to say it actually doesn't matter if you call it a subrecipient or a contractor or vice versa. It's kind of the characteristics of the relationship that really matter. So you can see we have a citation from 2 CFR 200, and this is one definition of a subrecipient, a non-federal entity that receives a subaward from a pass-through entity to carry out a federal program. Now, that's a subrecipient. I would say a definition of a contractor, just to draw the comparison, is a contractor is typically the result of some kind of competitive procurement process, whereas a subrecipient usually isn't. But again, check out 2 CFR 200, also the contractor's manual. There's more explanation along these lines. Great, let's continue on to maintenance. So there are really only 2 items here, but it's worth kind of taking our time with this to the extent we can. So you would provide a written vehicle plan that would also include vessels if you're one of those FTA recipients that operates ferry service. The important thing about your vehicle maintenance plan is it has to explicitly define your system of periodic inspection. So you'll actually put the preventive maintenance intervals, usually it's defined as mileage, in your written vehicle maintenance plan. And that plan absolutely must reflect your current fleet configuration, because actually it's not part of the RIR process, but after you submit your RIR, but prior to your virtual site visit, your reviewer is actually going to take your listing of vehicles that you uploaded in the satisfactory continuing control section, and they're going to select from that listing a number of vehicles that they want to see the maintenance history for, and they'll just validate that you're performing preventive maintenance as it's described in your written vehicle maintenance plan. So please keep that in mind. Your written vehicle maintenance plan, again, has to be absolutely up to date, reflect your current practices and your current fleet. If it's like a dusty document that you pull out of the drawer every 3 or so years when you have a triennial, that's probably a sign of trouble. Let's move on to item B. The RIR is asking for the written facility maintenance plan if you have any FTA funded facilities. Now remember, these are facilities with FTA interest, meaning they were constructed in whole or in part with FTA money, or they were renovated with FTA funds. So again, your facility maintenance plan should also describe a system of periodic inspection and preventive maintenance, and your reviewer will seek to determine if your actual facility PM is matching up to what you said you do in your written plan. Great, continuing on, let's talk about procurement, one of my favorites. The RIR asks in item A for your current procurement policies and procedures. I just want to highlight one thing that I know I and my colleagues have seen. Oftentimes when we're dealing with cities or municipalities, they might have what they call a procurement document, or maybe it's called a purchasing policy, but it would be kind of more generic. It might reflect some of the requirements of 2 CFR 200, but probably not all the specific things that FTA would be looking for. So if you have one of those more generic purchasing policies, check to see if you have an FTA specific procurement policy. That's probably what your reviewer would be more interested in seeing. Just very quickly, item B, the RIR is asking for, well, A&E procurements. That stands for architectural and engineering procurements. You have to use a separate procurement process for those. It's a qualifications-based process. Sometimes you'll hear it described as a Brooks Act procurement. Well, if you're a state and you're not using that Brooks Act, but you have a similar state law, you would actually want to provide that. It just has to be adopted prior to August 10th, 2005. Now, items C and D, these are 2 things that I typically actually see within the FTA procurement policy itself, but if they are separate, obviously you'd want to provide those. So item C is asking for procurement standards of conduct. So that's like conflict of interest provisions. And then procurement protest procedures also have to be in writing. So you would provide that separately if it's not already included in your procurement procedures. Great, moving on to item E. So really, items E to I, this is kind of one of the more important things that you'll submit in your RIR, but there's also an additional step that'll happen before your virtual site visit. So with your RIR, you're providing your reviewer with a list of FTA-funded procurements that you've awarded since your last review. Again, a tabular format would be the best way to communicate this. What's going to happen is prior to your site visit, your reviewer will select from your listing of FTA-funded procurements a number of procurements that they want to do a file review of. Of course, this will be in a virtual context, so there's a little bit of maybe an additional administrative burden on recipients to, scan in and upload those things, but work with your reviewer and see if there's like a good, happy medium in terms of maybe very voluminous things that you might have to scan in, or maybe your reviewer will just specifically identify things that they want to see. Well, included in this listing of FTA funded procurements, you want to note any change orders over 250,000 that were executed. As you might know, 250,000 is the simplified acquisition threshold. That means anything estimated to cost more of that has to follow a formal purchase procedure. So you'd have to actually put out a solicitation like an RFP, a request for proposals, or IFB, invitation for bid. And because it's more than 250,000, your reviewer will check to see a couple things. They'd want to see an ICE, an independent cost estimate. They would also want to make sure that that change order is within the scope of the underlying contract. If it's not, it's called a cardinal change, and that's typically treated like an unjustified sole source award. Continuing on, just very quickly, G asks for a list of any protests you've received during the review period. H is looking for a list of capital leases awarded since your last review. And I is looking for a list of legal claims regarding procurement. So perhaps, hopefully you're not in this boat, but maybe there was a bid protest that resulted in perhaps an injunction being filed. That's exactly what we're talking about here under item I. Great, let's continue on. Okay, Matt, I can actually toss it back to you for DBE.
Great, thank you, Greg. For disadvantaged business enterprise, DBE, the first thing that the RER requests is your most recent DBE program. If it's not uploaded to TRAMS, I would definitely recommend checking your DBE program before you submit it to make sure that it's current, that it actually reflects what your current situation is. You may know that the DBE program doesn't have to be provided on a periodic basis like a lot of the civil rights documents do. Just has to be uploaded or resubmitted rather if there's been a significant change. But one of the key things that we see is sometimes the DBLO that's listed in the DB program is not the person who's actually serving as the current DBLO and DB liaison officer. And so check your DB program, make sure that it contains everything it's supposed to contain and that it reflects your current situation, including who the DBLO is, and then provide that to your reviewer. And obviously, if it does have that significant change, then resubmit it to your RCRO and to TRAMS. For item B, provide a current organizational chart, which includes the DBLO, again, the DBE liaison officer. The chart should indicate that the DBLO has direct and independent access to the CEO, basically meaning that they don't have to go through channels if they want to talk to the CEO about DB matters or implementation of the DBE program. For item C, the Dblo job description, this is actually the job description of whoever's holding that Dblo position. And hopefully the job description says at some point, some of the responsibilities the Dblo has relating to DBE. So hopefully the job description has that DBE component in it. For item D, the documentation of implementation of small business element procedures. So your DB program is required to have a small business element, basically how you're outlining how you're going to foster small business participation. This was added as a requirement in 2012. And so your reviewer is basically going to do two things. They're first of all going to look at your DB program and make sure that element is there. And second of all, they're going to want to see any documentation or evidence that you have that you have implemented the small business element as you said that you would in your DB program. For item E, a shortfall analysis and corrective action plan, if not required to be submitted to FTA. So obviously you have your 3-year DBE goal, and for each fiscal year, then you have to meet that DBE goal. It's not a triennial. You don't get to get 3 years to meet it. You have to meet it every single fiscal year. So if you have a 3% goal for 2019 and you only got 2.5%, you didn't meet your goal. And so in that case, you've got what FTA considers to be a shortfall, and they ask you to perform a shortfall analysis as to why you didn't meet your goal and how you can meet it again or meet it next time. And so they ask you to explain basically a gap analysis, what went wrong, what are you going to do to fix it, and what's the timeline during which you're going to take those actions. And so I would recommend going back to your uniform reports for each fiscal year during the review period. Look at what your goal was, look at what your actual DB participation attained was, and if there is a shortfall, make sure that you perform that shortfall analysis. Some agencies, top 50 agencies, as determined by funding, actually have to submit this to their RCRO by December 29th of the calendar year in which they did not meet their goal in the fiscal year. But if you're not in that top 50, then basically you just perform the shortfall analysis and you keep it in your records for the next oversight review that FTA has, which in this case, of course, would be the triennial review or the state management review. So make sure that if you had any shortfalls in any of the last 4 years during this review period, that you have that shortfall analysis and you can provide it to the reviewer. Under item F, provide a list of any DBEs that were terminated or substituted on a project. If a prime contractor terminates or substitutes a DBE, there are certain requirements that are present. They have to show good cause, they have to get your prior written approval, and there's kind of a litany of processes that they have to go through. And so if you provide this list of any DBEs that were terminated or substituted during the review period, then your reviewer can follow up and make sure that all those requirements were followed. You can see that we've got a circular or a CFR reference rather, as far as what those requirements and what documentation was required, what those all were. Moving on to Title VI. So the first item in Title VI is your most recent Title VI program, if not uploaded to TRAMS. Obviously, we know that your Title VI program is something that's submitted on a periodic basis every 3 years. So it's possible something that's being revised. If that's the case, remember just to note that in the notes column in the RR. And once it's finished, then and approved by your board, then send it to your reviewer. If it's not actually approved by the board, but it's ready to basically go, and you don't anticipate any changes, you could submit it to your reviewer and just say, hey, it's in draft form. If anything changes, we'll give you an updated copy. For item B, provide a listing of Title VI investigations, complaints, and lawsuits that have occurred since the last Title VI program submission. Obviously, one of the elements of your Title VI program is that you include a listing of all Title VI investigations, complaints, and lawsuits. So any of those that occurred prior to your last submission should conceivably be or presumably be included in your Title VI plan. So your reviewer is just looking for any of those that have happened since your last Title VI plan was submitted. For item C, provide a list of language assistance training for staff, any details on training, tools, or other resources that you've used to ensure that limited English proficiency persons, LEP persons, have access to transit system information and services. For item D, provide examples of public participation activities performed since the last comprehensive review that align with the Title VI program. And I'll say a couple things here. First of all, so in your Title VI program, then you're required to have a public participation plan that outlines how you're going to provide early and continuous opportunities to minority and LEP populations to involve them in transit making decisions. And so one thing to note is that whatever's in your Title VI plan is what you're going to be held to. And so if in your Title VI plan, in your public participation plan, you say you're going to do X, Y, and Z in certain circumstances, then when the reviewer comes along, you want to be able to document that you have in fact done those X, Y, and Z and items in the particular circumstances. So just keep that in mind and make sure to provide any examples of public participation that you can. Provide a list of transit facilities cited or constructed since the last review, and also copies of the corresponding equity analyses. So if you've either cited or you have constructed a new transit facility, you're required to do an equity analysis. This applies whether you are below or above the Title VI threshold. Obviously, the requirement to do regular Title VI equity analyses for major fare changes or for fare changes or major service changes, that only applies if you are over the Title VI threshold. In other words, that you have over 50 or more vehicles in peak service and you're in an urbanized area of 200,000 or more. That requirement to do those equity analyses only applies if you're above that threshold. This is different. The requirement that you perform a equity analysis for a transit facility that you're citing or constructing, that requires regardless of the threshold. So if that's applicable to you, just make sure that you have that and provide it to the reviewer. Similarly, in F, this is more forward-looking. If you have any transit facilities that you're planning on doing in the next few years, in the next 3 years, Provide the equity analyses if they've been performed. If they haven't been performed because it's too early in the process, just explain that to the reviewer. For item G, provide a list of any fare changes or major service changes since the last TEL6 program submission. Include the dates of the change and a brief description of the change. And this one is what I was referring to earlier, that only applies if you're above that TEL6 threshold of 50 peak vehicles and in a UZA of 200,000 or more. So we just provided a list of any fare changes and major service changes. Now we want to make sure in item H that we're also providing those actual equity analyses for those changes. Similarly, in item I, if you have engaged any new fixed guideway service or new starts or small starts projects, then provide the equity analyses for those. I'm going to skip over J because that's just for states. K, I'll mention just in case there are any MPO direct recipients on this call, but provide a list of all sub-recipient applications received during the review period. Your reviewer will just want to make sure that those sub-recipient applications had everything they're supposed to. Obviously, those can involve a lot, especially if it's a first-time recipient. So include accepted and rejected applicants that are minority organizations or serve minority low-income areas, and the amount of funds. Here we've got some more RAR tips for you. Use again that comments from recipients column of each RAR section's table as often as possible. We're just going to keep pounding that home. If you have questions about what you need to provide, contact your reviewer and ask. That RAR letter that you received has your contractor identified. They may not know who exactly at the contractor, if it's a company, for instance, who exactly is going to be performing your review at this point, but nonetheless, they'll be able to provide you with any information that you need about what you're supposed to provide. Then they'll be happy to do it too. They'd rather that you contact them and ask about anything that you're unsure about, rather than, you know, potentially do unnecessary work or submit something that's not actually appropriate. Then finally, use links to your website or other websites or documents where appropriate. So if you have a reasonable modification policy, for instance, on your website, you don't need to, you know, send a PDF of your reasonable modification policy. You can just include a link to your reasonable modification policy. It's the same thing. Which is a good segue to ADA General, Americans with Disabilities Act. This is broken up into two sections now. There's ADA General, and then there's also ADA Complementary Paratransit. So we'll hit General first. The first requirement that's being requested, the first document that you're being asked to provide, is the ADA complaint procedures. Obviously, under ADA, you're required to sufficiently advertise to the public the means by which someone can make a complaint if they feel aggrieved under the ADA. So you can provide a website citation. Excuse me, that's perfectly acceptable. One thing we do want to emphasize is that sometimes we see an agency will have the complaint procedures on their website, but it'll be under the Complementary Paratransit section. And we want to emphasize that the ADA complaint procedures, they should be broader than that. You can have ADA complaints relating to fixed route, relating to bad customer service, that you know, maybe somebody used pejorative terms to describe someone with a disability or something like that. So there are things beyond just Complementary Paratransit where ADA complaints could come into play. And so while it's great to have it on your website under the Complementary Paratransit section, it's much better to have it where it's clearly applicable to all. Then next up, for your ADA complaint form, this is something, again, the website citation is acceptable. You can either have the complaint form, or sometimes rather than a complaint form, there's just the complaint process. So how you go about, who you contact, and how you go about filing the ADA complaint, that's acceptable as well. For item C, the ADA complaint record retention procedures. So you're supposed to keep ADA complaints for a year and a summary of all your ADA complaints for 5 years. So provide your procedures as far as that goes. For item D, provide driver handbooks, operating and training manuals, and ADA related service bulletins. Basically what we're saying here, that your reviewer is going to want to look at, you know, how you're training your operators, and making sure that there's nothing contrary in there, that you don't have training materials that are from, you know, pre-2015 and contain the term common wheelchair, which is now prohibited, those types of things. For item E, sample internal service provision monitoring materials, such as surveys, checklists, interview forms, etc. So basically, you should have some type of a system where you are monitoring your operators, your employees, to make sure that they're complying with provision of service requirements, things like announcing stops on the vehicles. They're picking up members of the public that are in wheelchairs at bus stops. They're not passing them by. So how do you do that? Do you have, ride-alongs like secret shoppers? Do you review the camera footage off the vehicles? Do you have a manager follow some of your operators around periodically just to make sure that they're doing everything that they're supposed to be doing? Do you have taped phone calls? Whatever it happens to be, then just provide those to your reviewer or explain those to your reviewer. Next up is the ADA reasonable modifications procedures. These are supposed to be advertised on your website. Obviously, you want to advertise to the public that you're able to make, or that you're willing to make, reasonable modifications to your policies and procedures if requested. So provide a website citation to that. Provide any rider's guides, including paratransit guides. Again, your reviewer is going to look through, just make sure that there's nothing contrary. We say including paratransit guides even though there's another paratransit section, just because sometimes we find that there is information that does relate more than just to paratransit that included in the paratransit guide. So go ahead and include those too. For item H, provide a list of new facilities that were constructed or altered since the last review. Your reviewer is going to just make sure that those were, if they're constructed or altered, that they were made accessible to the extent feasible. Provide a current certification of equivalent service and supporting analysis. This is somewhat limited to, it's only if you're a demand response service provider and you've acquired an inaccessible vehicle since the last review. So if you're providing demand response and you've acquired an inaccessible vehicle, then you have to do an equivalency of service analysis to basically determine that the members of the public that are not disabled and the members of the public that are disabled are being treated equivalently. So you go through that analysis, and then you also file a certification of equivalent service with FTA. So provide both the certificate and the supporting analysis to your reviewer. Now moving on to ADA with complementary paratransit. The documents that are requested are, first of all, the paratransit rider's guide. And just to emphasize, complementary paratransit is required for any organization that is providing fixed route service. There are a couple of very limited exceptions, but basically that's the general rule. If you're providing fixed route service, then you also have to provide paratransit service to complement that. So the documents being requested are the paratransit rider's guide, the paratransit application form, item C, operations, dispatch, scheduling, or reservation procedures. Basically, your reviewer is going to want to make sure and confirm that your procedures say that if somebody requests a pickup at a certain time, that you're accommodating them within an hour on either side of that requested time. When the reviewer is doing the review, they'll make sure that this is happening in practice, but they also want to see here that's outlined in your procedures appropriately. For item D, provide sample notification letters for conditional eligibility, temporary eligibility, and denials of eligibility. So when somebody applies for ADA complementary paratransit eligibility, then you go through an analysis and you make a determination of their eligibility. If they're granted anything less than unconditional eligibility, so again, conditional eligibility, temporary eligibility, or no eligibility at all, a denial, then you want to do two things. First of all, you want to give with specificity the reasons why they were not given unconditional eligibility. And you also want to give them the right to appeal, so that if they think that that determination was incorrect, there is a due process component where they can request further review. So provide notification letter templates for conditional eligibility, temporary eligibility, and denials. For item E, provide definitions for trip denials, for missed trips, for on-time performance, and for excessively long trips, basically all your capacity constraints. So your reviewer will just make sure that the definitions are correct, that you're using the correct definitions, and that it also provide the data that you have to show that you're monitoring your service for capacity constraints as well, and that if you've identified a capacity constraint, what you're doing to mitigate and address that capacity constraint. For item F, ADA complementary paratransit service contracts, provide, I want to note here that basically any contract that you have for contracted service, you want to provide to your reviewer. So not just the complementary paratransit service. If you have service contracts with taxis or with TNCs, transit network companies, or anything along those lines, then provide all of those to your reviewers so they can take a look. Then for item G, provide any oversight tools that you have for any service provided under contract or other relationships. So any of that contracted service, how are you overseeing to make sure that all the ADA complementary paratransit and ADA general requirements are being met? So provide the actual agreements, provide oversight tools, required reports, questionnaires, checklists, anything that you've got. Then here, basically the same thing, but for sub-recipients. So if you have sub-recipients and they are operating complementary paratransit, just make sure to provide any oversight tools you have for them. Again, if you're doing site visits, if you're writing reports and noting any compliance issues and then following up with the sub-recipients so that they make corrective actions to remedy those compliance issues. Anything you have along those lines, provide to your reviewers so they know that you're exercising appropriate oversight for ADA regulations over your subrecipients. Last in civil rights is equal employment opportunity. The first thing we're going to ask you to provide is a head count, the number of recipient employees working on the FTA funded program. A couple things here. We're talking about transit related employees. So, you know, that could be operators, it could be maintenance people, it could be admin people, it could be the CEO, anybody who's touching the FTA funded program. And this also includes full and part-time employees, so both of those. And the number of employees, along with some financial thresholds, will determine the applicability of EEO and whether or not you have to have an EEO plan. And there are a couple different types of EEO plans. If you request or receive $1 million or more in federal operating or capital assistance, or $250,000 or more in planning assistance in a given year, and you have at least 50 or more transit related employees, then you have to have an abbreviated EEO program. If you meet one of those two prongs in the financial threshold, you have 100 or more transit related employees, then you actually have to have a full EEO program, which has some extra elements on top of what's included in the abbreviated program. So be accurate with your head count and provide whatever program you have if you do meet those thresholds. Provide sample documents used for internal and external dissemination of the EEO program. So example documents for internal dissemination might be, you know, the posters that you have in your break room or your cafeteria or something like that. Examples of external dissemination of the EEO program would be things like job listings or recruitment listings, where it states that whatever your agency is, that you are a equal employment opportunity employer. So those would be what we're talking about there. Then for item D, provide the organizational chart identifying the EO officer. We want to make sure that the EO officer, they should be an executive and they must have a direct reporting relationship to the CEO. If they don't have a direct reporting relationship, then they can have a dotted line relationship. But basically what that means is they don't have a direct reporting relationship in all functions of their job, but they do have a direct reporting relationship when it comes to discussing EEO. So provide that organizational chart identifying who the EEO officer is and their relationship to the CEO. And one thing actually I'll mention here too is the EEO officer, unlike, you know, your Title VI coordinator, your ADA coordinator, those other areas, or your DBLO, your EO officer actually has to be referred to by their name, not their title or anything like that. So when going back to the dissemination documents for internal and external dissemination, anytime you're doing that, you want to actually use the EO officer's name. For item E, the designated employee and EO officer job descriptions. So provide the job descriptions for both the EO officer and also any support staff that have been assigned to provide ancillary assistance to the EO officer in implementing the EO program. So for the EO officer, then, you know, they're supposed to meet with the CEO at least semi-annually to discuss the progress of each unit in the agency as far as EO goals and objectives are concerned. So things like that should be in the job description. Just make sure that, you know, their job descriptions actually include those EEO components. The reviewer wants to make sure those are in there. For item F, the standard performance evaluation for managers and supervisors. For item G, the employment practices chart. I'm not going to go into everything that's supposed to be in that, but we've got a circular reference here that lists that information. For item H, EEO complaint logs. submit all the complaints that you've received under EO. Those could be complaints made to the EO officer or to HR. It could also include litigation if it's reached that level. And it could also include claims that have been filed with administrative agencies, so like the EOC, et cetera. So provide a log of all those complaints. Feel free to redact employee names for privacy considerations. That's not, your reviewer doesn't need to know the employee names or anything like that. For item I, provide agendas, sign-in sheets for meetings conducted when the EO policy and its implementation are explained. So if you have sub-recipients and you're meeting with them and explaining all the things that they're supposed to be doing under EO because your sub-recipients meet that those thresholds, then provide documentation to evidence that those meetings occurred, what happened, so the agendas, sign-in sheets, etc. Similarly, when you are training new supervisors or management, provide any agendas or sign-in sheets or an example of the PowerPoint that was used, any of those types of things as well. K, list EO training topics. L, provide a list of all the newly hired supervisors and managers who attended the EO supervisory training. When somebody gets promoted to a supervisory position, they're supposed to have EO training within 90 days. So provide that list, and their reviewer will probably have a follow-up just to make sure that they did receive that training and what entailed. For item M, sample of recruitment entities and ads for job positions. And a log of recruitment locations or recruitment dates for the review period. So if you went to a job fair and were advertising positions there, that type of thing. And then O, a list of internal and external dissemination of the EO program for each year since the last EO plan update. So again, this is kind of similar to Title VI. All of the internal and external dissemination would be a component that you're doing, would be a component of the EO program. So your viewer is just looking to see, what did you do as far as that internal and external dissemination since your last EO program submission. For item P, provide a list of meetings with affinity groups since the last EO plan update. So those could be like local business organizations or educational institutions or anything along those lines. If you had any meetings with those. Under Q, a list of sub-recipients and or contractors that meet the threshold to develop an EO program. So again, if you have any sub-recipients and they meet one of those prongs for the financial component and they meet the number of transit-related employees thresholds of either 50 or more or 100 or more, then that sub-recipient needs to have an EO program, either the abbreviated or the full, and you have a responsibility, since the standard sub-recipient stands in your shoes, you have a responsibility to oversee them, collect their EO program, review it for sufficiency, make sure that they're implementing the EO program correctly. Similarly, same thing for contractors. So a couple more RIR tips. First, make sure your documents are dated. So if your reviewer somehow ends up with 3 of the same thing, they know which is the current one that they should actually be reviewing. Provide, if a requested document is in the process of being revised, indicate that in the RIR comments. So again, your 3-year Title VI program or your 4-year EO plan, just make sure that if those are in flux, that you note that to your reviewer. Again, you could provide a draft if it's substantially complete and just going to the board or something like that, but just make sure that your reviewer is apprised of all that. If after the RIR submission you have updated documents or new documents, submit them to your reviewer. One thing I'll note here is that I would contact your reviewer either by phone or email and say, hey, I've got some new documents for you. Would you like me to email them to you? Would you like me to add them to the FTP site because they're really big, that type of thing. Most FTP sites don't actually give any type of notice that new documents have been added. And so if you just add things to the FTP site without also letting your reviewer know, then they may not ever see them, which is obviously problematic. So definitely reach out to them. And then also keep your reviewer informed about any changes or additions to what is submitted. So again, if you didn't have an allowability of cost policy, but then you listened to Greg talk about that earlier and you're like, oh darn, we have to have an allowability of cost policy in writing, maybe you have to add that after the fact because it takes you a week or 2 to put it together. Let your reviewer know that, hey, we just added this allowability of cost policy. So Greg, back to you for school bus.
Thanks, Matt. And I'll cover this one pretty briskly. So school bus, basically the idea here is FTA does not want its recipients operating exclusive school bus service, because that would be kind of like the federal government subsidizing something directly in competition potentially with local private school bus operators. So If perhaps you do provide school bus service, you would need something like special permission, or perhaps you have this service that's exclusively funded by local monies. That's when you would want to hit A, B, and C here. So very quickly, A is a list of any assets used in that exclusive school bus operation. B, a list of sub-recipients, contractors, and lessees that operate exclusive school bus service. And C, a list of any complaints received relating to the school bus service. Great, we can move on. This is very similar, charter bus, the same general idea. FTA recipients should not be operating charter bus service because that would be the federal government subsidizing something directly in competition with the private business. However, like any good rule, there are exceptions here. So there are technically, and you'll see this laid out in the contractor's manual, charter bus exceptions that you are allowed to provide. There are certain reporting and record keeping requirements associated with that. So you can see in item A, the RIR is asking for a charter service log that clearly identifies which exception you relied upon when you provided the charter service. Item B, a list of any real property and equipment used in the charter bus operations. Item C, the RIR is asking for a list of subrecipients, contractors, and lessees that operate charter service. And then similar to school bus, item D, a list of any complaints received related to charter bus service. Great, now I'm going to talk about the first of two drug and alcohol topics. The first is DFWA, the Drug-Free Workplace Act. So under item A, the RIR is asking for your written drug-free workplace policy. So this is actually different from your drug and alcohol testing policy that I'll talk about in a bit. However, not to confuse things, I have seen many instances where the DFWA content is actually included in the drug and alcohol testing policy. So just note that with your uploads. Item B is asking for examples of drug-free awareness notifications. This typically takes the form of EAPs, employee assistance programs. So you would want to upload any brochures, posters, or similar information. Item C, the RIR is asking for the number of employees with a federal or state criminal drug statute conviction during the review period that occurred within the workplace. So if that number is anything other than 0, you would want to provide, of course, that number, and your reviewer would seek to confirm that certain steps were taken after that. There's a timeline where certain stakeholders have to be notified. Let's move on to the next section. 18, drug and alcohol testing program. So the first thing the RIR is asking for is a copy of your board adopted drug and alcohol policy with the date of the board adoption. I do want to note that a lot of organizations out there might not technically have a board of directors. They might have some kind of other final authority. Well, that's exactly who would have to adopt your policy. Moving on to item B, the RIR is asking for a list of covered employees who are in safety sensitive positions, and also any supervisors or company officials that are charged with making that reasonable suspicion determination. So you would want to include the name and date that each of these individuals was placed in that either safety sensitive position or started making those reasonable suspicion determinations. Item C, the RIR is asking for the training programs for covered employees and supervisors. There's more information there, of course, in the contractor's manual if you need more specifics. And in item D, the RIR is asking for certificates of service agents. So this is asking for things like BATs, breath alcohol technicians, or collectors, MROs, medical review officers. They all have to have current certifications. So you would actually upload, typically what we see is the actual certificates that note the date of expiration. Continuing on, in item E, the RIR is asking for a list of subrecipients, contractors, subcontractors, and lessees having safety-sensitive employees. Again, this is just related to the oversight that an FTA recipient would have to provide over subrecipients and contractors. Great, and I'll toss it back to you very quickly, Matt.
Yep, I'll breeze through these programmatic areas. For section 5307, the first thing that's requested is a signed Metropolitan Transportation Planning Agreement between the recipient, the MPO, states, and any public providers of public transportation. So basically outlining who's going to do what are the responsibilities of each party. B, if you're relying on your MPO's public participation plan and tips and tip notices, then provide those to your reviewer. If you're relying on your own public involvement process, then provide your own public notices, coordination processes, list of complaints, final and amended POPs. Then in addition, what your written policy is for soliciting public comment prior to implementing a fare increase or major service reduction. Probably notice that this sounds a little bit similar to Title VI, except Title VI is talking about any fare changes at all, not just fare increases, and major service changes, not just major service change reductions. The difference is that in Title VI, then you have to do those equity analyses if you're above that threshold. In 5307, then even if you're below that Title VI threshold, then the 5307 requirements still apply. So what is your written policy for soliciting public comment prior to implementing a fare increase or major service reduction? Then in item E, what your half fare special identification card application is, how difficult is it to actually get that for seniors and people with disabilities? And then for F, list of fare increases or major service reductions implemented since the last review with the date of implementation. We've got a couple more RIR tips. Just make sure your documents are readable. Most likely your reviewer is not like an IT specialist or anything like that, so avoid proprietary formats. If you can use Office formats like Word, Excel, PDF, etc., that's great. And try and not lock or otherwise protect documents that might limit the reviewer's ability to search or highlight. Then with section 5310, the only things that are asked for are state correspondence approving a public body to coordinate services for seniors and persons with disabilities, if applicable. Item B, certification documentation that no nonprofits are readily available, if applicable. And then finally, a sample section 5310 vehicle lease. And we'll skip 5311 because it's only applicable to states. Greg, PTASP.
Great, thanks, Matt. So this is one of the two brand new ones. Well, there's technically three new ones for you as we described with Tam, but PTAS, Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan. So item A, the RIR is asking for your agency safety plan and of course all the reference documents, including policies or procedures. Kind of like the drug and alcohol testing policy, you have to show that your board of directors or whatever the equivalent final authority is has approved your ASP agency safety plan. You would also, if you're a rail transit agency, provide under item C documentation of the safety plan's approval by the SSOA, State Safety Oversight Agency. In item D, the RIR is asking for an org chart or some other documentation that shows that the CSO, that's Chief Safety Officer, has an uninterrupted line of authority. And if that's not already detailed in the ASP, of course, you would provide that as a separate document. Move on to the next slide. Great. Under item E, the RIR is asking for an emergency preparedness and response plan, but this is only for rail transit agencies, so keep that in mind. Item F and G, those are for states only. So I think in the interest of time, so we get to your questions, we can skip those. And this is our final area, cybersecurity. Again, it's brand new. And actually within just the context of the RIR submission, there are no documents that you would have to upload here. In fact, cybersecurity, this review area is only applicable if you operate rail service. And if you take a look at the contractor's manual, you'll see that under cybersecurity, there's just one question currently. So this is a very light area, at least at present. I think we can all kind of read the tea leaves and envision this becoming more important in the future. So perhaps in future review cycles, there'll be things you'll have to upload here, but not this time.